You want to come and say hi? You want to come and say hi to the people? Hello. I got a puss. Camera shy. Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Knitting Vicariously podcast. My name is Caroline. I'm found more commonly across Instagram and Ravelry as dunderknit. I'm a knitter living in London in the UK, and if you're new and joining the podcast for the first time, hello and welcome. A very brief word of warning to say that this is a swearing-friendly podcast, and therefore if you are not fans of the cursing and the swears, or indeed if your intention is to watch this with children, just a brief word of warning for you that the language is perhaps a little bit on the sweary side from the here on out. So thank you so much for checking us out. If it's not your bag, I really appreciate it, but it's probably not going to be for you. To those of you who are coming back and who know my sweary tendencies all too well by this point, hello and welcome. I hope you're all very, very well. As ever, we've got a few bits to run through this week. One of the things I wanted to touch on right up front is to thank all of you so much for your comments, for your feedback, both on last week's episode and on our upcoming KAL. I'll touch on the KAL in a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to say first of all, thank you so much to those of you who were kind enough to put some comments in around the quality of the podcast. As I mentioned last week, I am starting to film on a fully fledged fancy schmancy pants camera rather than using my iPhone for the first time. I think I have hopefully sorted out the focusing issues a little bit better this week. So I know last week there were a few frames, particularly towards the end, that were a little bit on the Vaseline smeared soft focus side of things. So thank you so much to those of you who put up with it and who saw it through to the end. To those of you who noticed nothing different, I promise you, my features are not quite that romantically focused in real life. But yes, so I did have a little bit of blurring towards the end. I think I have now managed to suss it. And so if you've got any other thoughts, any other feedback, please do let me know. But I really did appreciate you getting in touch. For those of you who asked, the camera that I was using previously was my iPhone. So it was the front-facing camera on my iPhone X. I have now switched this out for a Canon G7X Mark II. I am a big fan of all things Canon, and this camera is one that's been recommended by multiple friends, both for blogging and podcasting, as well as just being a great regular compact camera that does both the basic point and shoot as well as some of the sort of slightly fancier manual and sort of half manual settings for taking better pictures. So hopefully I have managed to sort out the autofocusing now, so we should be able to reap the benefits of both better close-ups with this camera that I couldn't do before with my iPhone, but also just slightly less fuzzy shots of me dancing around in the background. So fingers crossed, this is a bit of best of both. Those of you coming back may also have noticed something a little bit different in the background behind me. I took a little bit of time earlier on this week to sort out my stash wall to make sure that all of my purchases from Rhinebeck were now included in the cubby holes, as well as just having a bit of a general sort out to make sure that everything that's in here is stuff that I really, really love. And I'm delighted to have got it to a point now where I'm very happy with it. I do now have a slightly different setup, so I've got all sweater quantities on the bottom row behind me, so in a delightfully sort of semi-rainbow placement, as well as then up on this side we have single skeins of fingering weight, on this side is single skeins of DK, and then we have sock yarn along the top, as well as a few cubbies of single plies and single solid colour skeins as well. So yes, I had an awful lot of fun organising this. So to people who said they weren't sure how I was going to fit all of my Rhinebeck purchases in, I will have you know that they are all now in this wall behind me, barring I think one sweater quantity that's still out because that's going to be my cast on later on this week, as well as a couple of bits and pieces that I'm either working on or are going to be gifted. And so for the most part though, everything is in here, which yeah, does make me very happy to stand in front of and just lust after. I know a lot of people have mentioned that they think I'm in a yarn shop. I promise you I'm not. I'm also not intending to open for business anytime soon. Although if I do, it will be as a museum and I will be operating a very strict bag check policy, just so you're aware. As ever, I want to take the opportunity to thank those of you who have commented, who've shared the podcast, who are enjoying it, and so taken the opportunity to tell others about it. And in particular, I want to call out a couple of my fellow podcasters who have been doing exactly that, spending some time and frankly, just immersing themselves in my world of crazy and taking the time to mention it to others, for which I am incredibly grateful. In particular, there are three wonderful women that I want to call out, all of whom live in or around London and the South Coast, all of whom I've been following on their podcasts for a good number of years now, and until recently, only one of whom I'd actually met in person. And so the first of those, the one that I had met in previous years, is Nikki of the Tea and Possibilities podcast, who is Hippie Nikki over on Instagram. Nikki is someone I had the absolute pleasure of meeting a few years ago, back at an event that was run by Helen Stewart of the Curious Handmaid podcast and Kate of the A Playful Day, formerly A Playful Day, now Conversations from Our Days podcasts. A few years ago, Helen and Kate joined together to form a series of events called the Muse Society. These were events that were intended to bring together knitters and general yarn lovers from particularly across London and some of the southern England region, and really just to create a fantastic opportunity to engage in dialogue and to have really kind of inspiring conversations around different yarns, different makers, usually with sort of speakers on certain topics, and then a little bit of networking and some cake afterwards, which is never a problem where I come from. And I was lucky enough to sit next to Nikki at one of those events. We got to chatting, we introduced ourselves, and just had a really nice afternoon sitting and talking. And I don't think Nikki had started the podcast, or if she had, it was very early on. So I had the opportunity to kind of catch up with her using her podcast and see that as it grew. So it's been so fantastic to see some of the projects she's worked on over the years and kind of keep in touch with her that way. So if you don't already watch Nikki's podcast, I'd highly recommend it. Nikki is a keen crocheter as well as knitter, so has all ends of the crafty spectrum covered. She particularly enjoys a little bit of history and is a very big fan of a podcast that she's now got me hooked on, which is the Rex Factor. I will leave it to her to explain around it because she does it so much better than I will. But it's just a really lovely podcast, a chance to catch up with her on a regular basis and see some of the things she's working on. And alongside Nikki are two of her very good friends. We have Ellie of the Skein-Deer podcast and Amy of the Stranded podcast. Ellie of Skein-Deer has a myriad of beautiful designs, all of which are available through Ravelry. You will no doubt have heard of her on other podcasts. She's particularly renowned for some of her colour work, with the colour work mittens and sock collections that she has in particular. And Amy, on the flip side, is obviously the dyer behind the Stranded Dye Works, and she has just an incredible collection of colourways of yarn bases. Both of them have had podcasts going on for a good few years now, and both of them are podcasts I've been enjoying for a very long time. I had the pleasure of meeting them both at the Yarnporium event earlier this month in London. I had the chance to catch up with them both, see what they were working on, and have a little bit of a chat, and it was just so lovely to meet them both in person and find that they're exactly as warm and wonderful as they come across in their podcasts. And so if for whatever reason you have not had the opportunity to check out one or all of those, please go and do so, because they're all just really fabulous people to sit and have a bit of a tea and a knit with. In addition, there were a few others that I want to say a massive thank you to. Some of these I was aware of already, but some of them are new to me, and so thank you to those of you who've mentioned them to me in passing. I now have an opportunity to go and catch up with a raft of new people and see what they're up to as well. The first of these is another UK podcaster, and we have Hannah of the Tales of HiyaHiya podcast. Hannah is based in Cheltenham in the UK. She has the most gorgeous yellow Labrador, who is Jonah, who just seems to be so wonderfully kind of enigmatic and characterful and sleepy in some instances, but it's so lovely to catch up with her. She has an array of very beautiful designs that are also available and talks them through at length on her podcast as well. Predominantly her designs have been socks and shawl patterns, but she's also just released a brand new hat pattern which is stunning and has leapt right to the top of my hat queue, and so I really would recommend, again, if you enjoy a beautiful UK accent as well as a chance to see someone's creative process, I highly recommend that you check out her podcast, which is the Tales of HiyaHiya podcast over on YouTube. There is also Liesl of the Buckaloo View podcast. Liesl has a farm that's based over in New Jersey, which just looks so incredibly tranquil and peaceful. And again, similar to, I think I previously mentioned Lerka of the Fibre Tales podcast, it's a very similar vibe. If you're looking for something that's very calm and very chilled out and very serene, Liesl's podcast is another great opportunity to enjoy that very calming, very chilled vibe, and just a chance to catch up with her and all of the beautiful things that she's working on, as well as hear a little bit more about farm life generally. One new to me podcast was Lisa of the And So On podcast. Lisa's podcast is a brilliant mix of both sewing and knitting. Lisa's based in Ontario, but I believe is currently undergoing a bit of a house move, so fingers crossed that all goes super smoothly for you, Lisa, because I know how deeply stressful house moving can be. But yeah, she's got a really great mix of sewing projects that she's looking at, as well as some of the knitting things that she's working on, so definitely worth checking her out there too. We have Leslie, who is another UK podcaster. She has the Not Quite Enough Yarn podcast and is Knitting or Death over on Instagram. Her ethos is incredibly similar to my own, which I love, which is we buy yarn because it's pretty. And sometimes that means we don't always have quite enough yarn to knit the thing that we want to knit. Her mandate behind that is brilliant, which is that she tends to therefore knit a lot of things with stripes, a lot of things that are faded, and I just think that's a brilliant mentality to have, which is ultimately, if the thing is pretty, buy the thing and work out how to do with it later. But at the same time, I know Leslie's been on a little bit of a limitation in terms of how much she looks to stash. She's been knitting from her stash for a good long time now, and therefore I hope, Leslie, that my recent episodes have helped you to stash vicariously, if you like, because I feel like I've been doing enough stashing for the both of us. And then very last but not least, because I think their podcast has not long gone up, the wonderful Periscoping Sisters. I know that Amy of the Periscoping Sisters had mentioned me on the podcast most recently, so the episode that went up over the weekend. I have been following their podcasts for a good long while now. I really enjoyed seeing their time that they spent last year when they came over to EYF, and it was great to see them at the retreat beforehand, and then the time they spent up in EYF as well. I don't think I had an opportunity to say hello in person. It is a reasonably sized festival and you don't always get an opportunity to see everyone that you would like to, so I think unfortunately I missed them there. But I do greatly enjoy their podcast. They have such a wonderful chemistry, obviously because they're sisters, but again, it's a great opportunity to catch up on some chat and have an awful lot of fun laughing along with them as they go. And so thank you so much again to all of these podcasts for taking the time not only to watch but also to recommend this podcast on their channels. If I have missed anyone out, if I've missed you out, I'm so sorry. Please do feel free to pop a comment down in the comments section below and just let me know if there's anyone in particular that has recommended this podcast. I would love to take the opportunity to watch in return and go and say a massive thank you to them as well. Thank you so much to everyone that has been posting about this podcast over on Instagram as well. It's always so wonderful to pop over into Instagram and see that there are new posts in the Knitting Vicariously hashtag, the Blame Dunderknit hashtag, which seems to be doing very well as the Blame Dunderknit Along, which is obviously for the upcoming KAL. And as well as that, it's just lovely to see, you know, when you're posting in your stories that you're keeping, that you're perhaps having a cup of tea and doing some knitting and maybe catching up with the podcast. It makes me so happy to know that I'm able to just keep you all company as you go about your day. This week has been a difficult one, particularly for friends over in the US, between the results of the US midterms that came out last week, and for all that results were broadly fairly mixed, certainly some positive news in certain quarters and a bit of movement in that direction, which is no bad thing at all. In other news, obviously just some really devastating stories coming out of California, whether it be the mass shooting earlier on last week or even the wildfires that are taking hold over the weekend. I know that obviously Kathy of HOOKER'S Corner has been incredibly heavily affected by the fires in Paradise. Both she and her family, as well as the wider community there, have been left with almost nothing. And so there are a stream of initiatives that are going on at the moment between her GoFundMe page, which I will make sure I link in the description box below, as well as a number of dyers, of makers, all of whom are contributing part of their sales, or perhaps 100% of their profit from their sales, that's going towards her fund. I would urge you, if you're on Instagram, perhaps to take a look there and see if there are any opportunities for you to be able to support it that way. But all else failing, anything that you're able to do to be able to support the GoFundMe pages, or even just to share them if you're unable to contribute right now, is always going to be hugely appreciated. On a slightly brighter note, obviously we've had a few initiatives kicking off this week. We have the KAL that's coming up, which I will talk about momentarily, as well as Get Your Yarn Wishes Granted, which has kicked off again this year over on Instagram. In addition to Instagram, there was a thread that was posted over on Ravelry in the Knitting Vicariously group, and if you haven't yet found our group, if you go into Ravelry, if you look in the groups tab and search for Knitting Vicariously, you should find us there. Please do join us, come on over. But there was a thread that was started initially to say that the Get Your Yarn Wishes Granted initiative had started again this year, and it then turned into just a lovely place for wonderful people to do a little bit more in the spirit of generosity and giving. And that thread made me very, very happy. So thank you to those of you who have engaged in there. Yeah, you made me smile on a day that was full of some fairly shitty news coming out of the US, and so yeah, it was a really wonderful opportunity. And knitters, yarny folk generally, are a really, really fucking good bunch, and you just serve to prove that even further. So thank you so much for a little bit of love that was spent going round on Ravelry. But yes, the Ravelry group has gone a little bit crazy this week. So between the chatter thread for our upcoming KAL, as well as me spending time just catching up on newcomers to the group who've announced themselves or introduced themselves rather over on our welcome thread, as well as catching up with those of you who've been posting in our November chatter thread, and then lastly obviously everything connected to the KAL, I spent a good few hours just reading through messages, clicking love buttons. I will say, for me to reply to everyone in there individually, I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I'd let it slip a little bit this week, and so by the time I got around to it, there was just so much in there that I spent time kind of consuming rather than necessarily contributing. But please do know I have read all of the messages that are in there. I'm super excited about some of the plans you have for the KAL, and yes, I'm just delighted to see a community of people starting to grow where we really all enjoy spending this time knitting vicariously together. And it does sort of make up for not having quite so much actual knitting time. But given that I'm trying to host a podcast and I quite like to show you some reasonable progress week on week, I do have to try and balance the amount of time I spend on social media, reading through threads, as well as actually just getting knitting done. And so you will excuse me, I hope, if I have to just curtail my time there slightly. But yeah, it is a wonderful community and some great conversations that are happening there nevertheless. And I'm so happy to see it starting to grow. So thank you so much to those of you engaging, spending your time over there, having a chat. Yeah, hopefully you're getting a lot out of it too. And so yes, on to the subject of our upcoming knit-along. I call it a knit-along. It is hooking friendly as well, so if you choose to crochet along with us, please know that you are also welcome. I struggle to have a stitch along, or it doesn't roll quite so naturally off the tongue, so you will please excuse me if I refer to it as a knit along. Know please that all other crafty types are also welcome. We will be kicking things off this Thursday, that's Thursday the 15th of November, at whatever time is midnight in your local time zone. And so from Thursday until Thursday the 31st of January. And within that time, I would love you to cast on something that you're really excited about, that you are properly aching to cast on, whether it be a pattern, whether it be yarn that you're desperate to work with. Either of those things, it's really just an opportunity for you to start working on something that used to be vicarious that you're going to make actual. That is the intention of this knit along. And so if that means that you maybe have to purchase some new stash yarn to go with it, or maybe you have to purchase a few patterns and maybe see if there's anything there that you might like to knit with, this is your opportunity to feel fully enabled by me. And so consider this your disclaimer from me. This is your opportunity to cast aside anything that you should be working on, and I do dislike that word should, and instead cast on something that you want to be working on. I have intended to make this, or I've purposely made it with the dates such that if you are still doing gift knitting, hopefully you'll still be able to join us, at the very least in just casting on. I do appreciate that not everyone is quite so selfish and as wanton as me. But it should hopefully be a good opportunity for you to just enjoy some time spent working on those projects with us. And so, as I mentioned last week, there are a couple of small qualifications to it. So this is something that is going to be a new cast on, and therefore whips are not allowed. It's going to be something that's cast on between the dates of the 15th of November and the 31st of January. Ideally, you would also finish, but that is not compulsory at all. And indeed, if you want to use this as an opportunity to cast on as many things as you like, and then perhaps choose a couple that you want to work on to the point of completion, you are more than welcome to do that too. I have no issues with that whatsoever, and if that's the way you would like me to enable you, I'm quite happy to do that. Also worth mentioning that patterns of any sort are welcome, whether those be projects for other people. As long as it's a pattern that you're really excited to work on, that's fine. If you really want to knit your daughter a pair of wrist warmers, for instance, then all power to you. I am not that selfless. And so I'm deeply in admiration of you, but at the same time, if you choose to make toys, if you choose to make hats, if you do choose to make sweaters, and I will say I think the majority of people that I've seen in the chatter thread at the moment are intending to make themselves a garment, then please use this as your opportunity to do exactly that. We do also have a thread in the Ravelry group which is for people who have perhaps never knitted themselves a sweater or never knitted a garment, and so there are some really great tips in there about perhaps the types of patterns or constructions to choose and ways that you might want to go about it, as well as just being, again, a really great group to go and cheer each other on. And so if you're thinking about perhaps trying out your first garment but aren't totally sure where to turn, there's always an opportunity to look in that thread as well. If there are other knit-alongs ongoing that you want to take part in, feel free. You can double dip to your heart's content in any other KAL that is ongoing at the moment. I am not in the tiniest bit upset about that. But yeah, as I say, it will run from this Thursday. I'll put a bit of a countdown up on Instagram, and then from Thursday I will also make sure that I open the finished objects thread on Ravelry. As I mentioned last time, there are going to be 3 opportunities for you to win prizes. The first of those has already kicked off and is underway, which is to post within the chatter thread. So again, on Ravelry, in the Knitting Vicariously group, there is a chatter thread. It is fairly clearly marked. If you go in there, you will have an opportunity to write a myriad of posts about perhaps what you're thinking of casting on, engaging with others in terms of what they're thinking of casting on, and then once the KAL is underway, obviously sharing progress shots and just having a bit of chatter about the KAL itself. I will, at the end of the KAL, use random number generator to go back through there and allocate a prize to a specific post, and therefore the more engaged you are, the more conversations you're having, potentially, the better your chances. So worth bearing that in mind. The second way that you can win a prize here is going to be within the finished objects thread. I mentioned this last week, but from Thursday I will have a thread open on Ravelry, and you'll be able to go in and post any and all of your finished items over in that thread. I will emphasise this thread is going to be 1 post per person, and therefore if you only finish 1 item, that's fine, you're golden. You go in, you post it, and it's all good. If you finish more than 1 item, I would ask that you only write 1 post, and then each other item that you want to add in, you go in, you edit that post, and you add to that original post. And that way we're keeping it fair, whereby however many items you have finished, you just get 1 post along with everyone else in that thread. And then similarly, I will use random number generator to choose a lucky winner from that thread. But that means that regardless of how many things you've worked on, everyone has an equal chance to win in that particular thread. And then the third way that you can win is by using the Blame Dunderknit Along hashtag over on Instagram. And again, similar to the chatter thread, this is an opportunity for you to perhaps post thoughts or suggestions that you have from your stash that you'd like to work with in the lead up to the KAL kicking off. And then once the KAL is underway, progress shots, finished item shots, anything again that is relevant to that KAL, you are more than welcome to post using that hashtag. And again, once that's come to an end, I'll use everyone that is posted on that hashtag and I will have a look in there and allocate a prize on that basis too. I am still working on finalising the prize packages. I will make sure that I'm keeping you updated on those as we go along with the KAL, but please know that while prizes are one really great incentive to have as part of this knit along, the main thing here is really to cast on and really enjoy working on something, as well as engaging with people who hopefully are doing the same and can be very encouraging and friendly and just generally help to enable us all in this lovely cycle of vicarious knitting that hopefully produces some actual results. I'm going to talk about the KAL a little bit more in this week's Vicarious Knitting section, but in the meantime, I think I will start to move into the podcast proper. As always, show notes for this week's episode can be found in the description box below, as well as over on Ravelry in the Knitting Vicariously podcast group. There is, as ever, going to be an episode-specific thread for this week's podcast, and you'll be able to find links to anyone that I talk about, as well as the patterns over there this week. I will also post an update over on the Knitting Vicariously Instagram account. As I've mentioned previously, Knitting Vicariously is the Instagram account specifically linked to this podcast, and therefore each episode I will go in, I will post a new post in there along with links to all of the makers and the hashtags relevant to that week's episode. And that gives you an opportunity, if you are on Instagram and wish to follow some of those makers, hopefully it just makes that a little bit easier for you. But as ever, this week's episode is going to follow our standard format of actual knitting with a little bit of what I am wearing, followed by an FO, I know, and some works in progress before I move along to vicarious knitting, where we'll talk a little bit more about some of the projects and patterns that people have lined up for this week's KAL. But first things first, let me tell you about what I'm wearing. And this week, what I'm wearing is an oldie but a goodie. I realised last week when I was talking to you and wearing my Morning in Engelberg sweater, which thank you so much for your lovely comments on, it is one of my absolute favourites. I think I mentioned that having one gold cabled sweater perhaps wasn't enough. And then I thought about it and thought, hang on, I don't have one. I have two. This is the second one here. This is my beatnik sweater by Nora Gaughan, and this is a sweater that I will stand up momentarily, but this is a sweater that was actually published a number of years ago now in Knitty magazine, and therefore is a free pattern, and it is marvellous. I've spoken at length about my love of Nora Gaughan, as well as a few of her other counterparts who are incredibly adept at designing things with beautiful cable motifs, but this is definitely one of my favourites, so let me stand up and give you the full effect. And so here you have the beatnik boobies. Yeah, that's a phrase that never stops giving, isn't it? So yes, this is the beatnik sweater by Nora Gaughan. It has this fabulous central cable motif alongside these two slightly wider motifs here, and then everything else is, now I believe this is moss stitch. I should have looked this up last time as to whether it's moss stitch or seed stitch. I'm pretty sure it's moss stitch, but yes. So you have everything on the body of the sweater. Now, in theory, this panel should also be repeated on the back, but frankly, I was just not up for that. So you will see that the back is just plain moss stitch again. The ribbing on both the edges here as well as the neckline is all twisted rib, similarly with the hemline here at the bottom. It is, as ever, mid-hip length on me, which you're going to struggle to see, but trust me when it is roughly there. And yeah, I really love this jumper. So let me sit down and I will tell you a bit more about it. Look at that, it found me again. So yes, I knit this a couple of years ago now. I want to say I knit this maybe in 2016. No, it was 2015. 2015. I cast it on right back at the start of 2015. I finished it at the end of the year. I had a very long hiatus in between for reasons I will come on to momentarily. As I mentioned, it is a free pattern. It was part of a Knitty collection, and I'm amazed that it's a free pattern because it's such a good pattern. The cables and the charts that are in here are a little bit on the daunting side. I will say that up front. So they are color coded. There's a lot of different cables going on in terms of the different widths, in terms of how they are completed. But again, as with everything else, knitting patterns are only daunting if you get a little bit kind of flummoxed and look at them in their entirety. If you do what you're told as you go along, they're actually incredibly simple. It just means a little bit more kind of looking back and cross-referencing things. There is, I believe, a colour-coded chart for the cables now that's been published, which is incredibly helpful. Much easier to look at that than it was to look at the black and white chart as you went along. But yeah, I'd still highly recommend this as a pattern. So it is, in theory, it's knit in pieces. I knit it in the round, and I think, as I mentioned back in episode 4 where I talked about projects that I was particularly proud of, I mentioned that this is one that I was proudest of because I'd actually modified this to be worked in the round, and it was the very first time that I'd done that with the sweater pattern. In the pattern, this sweater is knit in pieces. I, however, cast on the full number of stitches for both the front and back at the hemline combined and joined that in the round and knit it in the round up to the armholes here. I then split the front and the back, worked those two separately, and then I 3 needle bound it off at the shoulders here, and then picked up and worked short row shaping for the sleeves on downwards. Last of all, I then just picked up around the neckline here. This is actually a folded over collar, which is one of the details about the sweater that I really love. I think the folded over collar really makes this, it polishes the sweater off really nicely, and it's something that I always think, if I come to a collar, it's something I'd really consider working on other colours as and when I find them. I don't think I've done it on any just yet, but it's definitely in my mind because I really enjoy the way that this sits, how it feels, and how it rounds off the rest of the sweater. So yeah. The yarn that I've used, because it's gold, and you know me in gold, it's just, I love it so much. This is Madeline Tosh. I know, you're all shocked, right? I know, it's ridiculous. This is her MCN worsted base, which is an 80-10-10 merino, cashmere and nylon base, which is in her Lannister gold colourway. This is a colourway that was popular, I want to say sort of 4 years ago, maybe slightly more. And certainly in 2014, when I think I bought the yarn, there was a huge amount of this colourway coming out of Madeline Tosh over her Black Friday sale, which may have been when I bagged some, I believe. But it's just the perfect combination of slightly, it's predominantly a sort of greenish yellow colour, but with a little bit of orange yellow in between, as well as a slightly dark, it's not quite a black wash that's over it, but there's certainly some really nice tonal hues to it, which I really appreciate. And it just means that it's tonal enough to keep things interesting in the sweater and not have it look too flat, which I really enjoy. It is, I would say, for all the wear that it's slightly pilly, so I'm not sure if you can see a couple of the small pills that are on here, but certainly nowhere as bad as I would have expected, given it is an MCN yarn. There is a fairly tight ply to this. It was slightly softer on my hands than working with Madeline Tosh Vintage, which is another of her worsted weight yarns. I found Vintage a little bit harder on my hands to work with. This is a little bit softer, but I still find the two fairly comparable in terms of their sturdiness and how they wear over time. So yeah, really love this sweater. I initially cast on the size 44 when I was knitting this in the first instance. I knit it, I think, just kind of up to a little bit above the waist, below the bust, tried it on and felt it was absolutely massive. So I ripped it out, I started over and knit the size 40. So this sweater here is the size 40. Now, the size 40 I am not currently a size 40. I am definitely bigger, significantly bigger than the size 40, and therefore I'm kind of amazed that this fits as well as it does. I put it on today thinking it was going to be far too small, but actually it fits reasonably well. If I were knitting this again today, the 40 is still not the size that I would choose. I would give myself something that was a little bit more forgiving in that sense, and probably opt to go up to the 44, but that being said, this has been a really interesting lesson in sort of fit and how the shape of a garment can dictate what the fit, even with significant negative ease, is going to be like. So because this has so much moss stitch, because the cables themselves pull this jumper in and make it really quite stretchy, I do think this is a pattern that's pretty forgiving when it comes to negative ease. That said, I think it's probably not a size that I would knit again. It's a size that I would like to be again, but it's not a size that I would knit again in other sweaters, but it just so happens that it works pretty well for this garment here. For the most part, I knit this using a 5.5mm needle, which is a US size 9 all over. The worsted weight yarn is definitely a worsted. I wouldn't go so far as saying it's an Aran weight, and so the moss stitch in particular, it's certainly not as dense as I would have expected if it were a true Aran weight. It does perhaps let in the wind a little bit in tighter days, but also I think that's down to the fact that it is a little bit on the negative E side at the moment as well, and so it's been made to work fairly hard. But yes, so for the most part I was using a 5.5 or US 9, but for the ribbing on all of the different sort of trim elements, whether it be the hems, the cuffs, the collar here, that's all a 4.5, which is a US size 7. But no, I really love this sweater. It is one of my favourites. I mentioned briefly that I did make a small mistake, and I did, and it came when I had separated for the front and the back, and I was knitting the back for the shoulders up into the back of the neckline here. I think I misread the instructions. I did not get the armhole shaping quite right on both sides, and therefore if I sit side on for a second, you will be able to see the shaping here is slightly odd. This comes a lot further forward than it would normally do on a true set-in sleeve. It should be back kind of up and over here, and as it is perhaps a little bit closer to the edge of my arms. That was really just down to me not reading the pattern properly. I realised it when it came to actually then picking up for the sleeves themselves, and I'm not, you know, ashamed to say that I botched it slightly. I changed my stitch count to make it work with what I had, and for all that this is definitely not quite what I was going for with the arm sides, I don't really care. Just that sounds very kind of like sort of flagrantly disobeying the rules, and I don't mean that at all, but it's just with this pattern, I think because I was modifying it for the first time, I was just intent on getting something that worked. I also, if memory serves, when it came to knitting this jumper, I had given myself a self-imposed deadline, which is that I wanted to knit 6 sweaters in 2015, and I believe I finished this sweater on New Year's Eve in 2015, and so I have my suspicions that this was a little bit of a kind of knitting frenzy that was happening in that Twixtmas period in between Christmas and New Year, and therefore I was just damned if I wasn't going to get the thing finished, and so left it in, whereas I might otherwise have gone back and changed it. But honestly, the fit of this feels fine. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. Of all the grand scheme of things that went wrong, I don't think I've miscrossed any cables. If I have done, don't tell me. It's just rude. I'd rather not know. No, I'm pretty comfortable and confident I've managed to get the most part right, and the bits that I wasn't too fussed about getting wrong, it's fine. It worked out for the best in the end. I don't think we'd be knitters if we didn't amply point out all of the mistakes that we've made in our finished items. I think there is something very human about that, which is you might think it looks great, but actually here, let me tell you everything that's wrong with it. But in this instance, it's definitely something that I can live with. It doesn't bother me, it doesn't change the fit, and yeah, I think it's, you know, it's just something I'm very, very happy to live with, because at the end of the day, I have a lovely sweater and I'm very pleased about it. So yes, this is my beatnik by Nora Gaughan from Knitty magazine. In terms of other things that I've been working on this week, as I mentioned, I do have one finished object to share with you. I have one work in progress, and I have one new cast on that is a work in progress as well. So without further ado, let me jump into those. The first thing that I have for you this week is my finished object, and that is my Slable hat. Here we are. So I cast this on my way back from the US on the plane journey, as I've mentioned to you previously. It didn't get quite as much done on that journey as I perhaps expected, but I did pick it up on my return home and start working on it properly. The yarn is Woolfolk Snow in the 1+2 colourway. The pattern is by Woolly Wormhead. I will put a picture of her modelled version of it up here. I double checked. I mentioned on last week's podcast that this is a pattern that I've had in my queue for a very long time. I put this in my queue in January 2011. That is how long I've been intending to knit this pattern, and so I'm really pleased that I finally got round to doing it. Let me show you a little bit of this up close so you can appreciate it in all its beauteous glory. So here we are. This is the Slable hat. It has at the bottom here, let me show you the front so you can see the pretty side, you have the alternating cable cast on, which is a little bit difficult to see, but it gives this slightly sort of rolled edge here, which is a much less harsh line than you get with your German twisted cast on or a long tail cast on. And you know, for that reason alone, as well as the fact it just looks really lovely, this is fast becoming one of my favourites for hat cast-ons in particular. You then have a whole host of 1x1 rib, and then you move into this section here, which is a combination of moss stitch and the cables themselves, and it's so pretty. Clearly I have a bit of a thing for moss stitch between the beatnik sweater that I'm wearing this week and the texture on here, but I really love it. And we've also then got the cables that you can see, the way that those are worked up, and then last but not least, some really lovely decreases coming up to the crown of the pattern itself. Let me pop this on for you because the hair situation is going well, but it makes sense for us to wreck it entirely. So here we go. Slightly off center, there we go. So this is the Slable hat, as I mentioned. I knit the large size, and the large size, it has some quite specific instructions for how many of the chart repeats you need to work, where you should start with the decreases. I kind of ignored those, mostly because they were intent on adding extra length to the hat, and I feel as though the length I have is more than enough. So in all honesty, this has worked out slightly longer than I think I would have liked as an ideal. If I sort of turn to the side, you should be able to see the side and the back. There is quite a lot of slouch built into here, which is fine. I don't mind some slouch. There's just probably a little bit more slouch than I would have liked. Now, in theory, I could fold up the brim. I'm not really a folding up the brim kind of gal, in all honesty, and so what I will probably look to do is I will block this. This hat has not yet been blocked. It needs to have a little bit of blocking done to it just to make it all kind of nice and evened out. I will see what it's like after blocking, and if it is still a little bit long, I will contemplate its future. It may be a case that I rip it out and take away some of the length, perhaps start slightly further up through the pattern. It may be that it ends up being gifted, but what this has done is it's taught me what I would like to do for the next working that I do of this pattern, because I'm quite sure there will be another iteration of this in, one moment, the second skein of Woolfolk that I picked up at Brooklyn General. So this skein here is, let me just show you here, this is Woolfolk Tinned in colourway number 27. It is of course gold, because of course it's gold, and for all that this is tinned rather than snow, the bases themselves are actually the same. The only difference is that the snow here, bring you back to me, hello, the snow here is a marl of both the pale white and the silver colourways, whereas this is obviously a single colour version. And yeah, I really do like it. As I say, I'm just slightly kind of uncertain about the length that's in here. I don't normally go for a super slouchy sort of hat, but you know, I also kind of feel like this is fine. I've mentioned previously, I'm probably not going to put a pom-pom on this. I know, Pom-Sacrilege, but at the same time, I don't think it needs it. I know it's kind of hard to see the decreases from here, but if I show you it here, the crown decreases work really nicely. They sort of all come together in this star-shaped pattern. Let me just pop you there. There you are. You can see they sort of swirl together in this star-shaped pattern, and it makes for a really nice set of decreases leading up to the top here. So I could add a pom-pom, but actually I think I will probably leave it as is, and yeah, go from there. So Slabel was knit up using my HiyaHiya circulars, so HiyaHiya steels for the lower part of the hat, 2.75mm for the ribbing, which is a US size 2, and then HiyaHiya HiyaHiya sharps, 3.25 for the top half of the hat, and those would be a US size 3. So both of those were 16-inch circular needles. I showed them in a little bit more detail on last week's podcast if you're interested. But yeah, they make it sort of quite speedy to knit up the hat without worrying about having to sort of magic loop or do anything with DPNs. I do move on to DPNs for the crown decreases towards the end. I'm not the biggest fan of them. They are a little bit fiddly, but very much necessary when it comes to some of the smaller circumference knitting up at the top here. And yeah, the yarn that I used, I ended up using almost all of the skein. I think I had maybe slightly less than 10 grams left, so I was definitely getting towards the end. Another reason why I wanted to kind of amend the length slightly to make it a little bit shorter, but I would say I used up probably around 90% of this, so somewhere in the region of around 200 or so yards. They are 50-gram skeins, worth bearing in mind, and so I think I used around 200 yards of this skein here. But yeah, really love this pattern, delighted to have finally knit it. Certainly a couple of things that I would take into account for the next time I work this pattern, but in the meantime, just really delightfully soft, lovely hat that I've got worked up. For my first work in progress this week, you will not be in the tiniest bit surprised to know that it is living in my little grey girl bag, which I have from Gemma, as you've seen in previous weeks, and it is my no frills sweater. My no frills sweater, I've managed to put a little bit more of a dent in this in terms of where I was last time. Let me hold it up so you can hopefully see the progress that's been made. So I am now down, having separated for the sleeves, I am now down in body island, if you want to call it that, just knitting around and around and around, trying to get as much of this body done as possible. I am knitting this in some black tonal sock yarn from Hey Sister Yarn Co. This is their Geronimo sock in the noir colourway, and I will pop that up, as well as the mohair that I'm using, which is from Das Monschaft, who is a hand dyer based in Germany, and her Virgo lace in the I Want to Believe colourway. I will pop these up and focus them, so you should be able to see them both a little better. So we've got this gorgeous tonal black colour on this side, and then just this lovely mishmash of very dark gothy rainbow colours over here in the Virgo lace, and the two of them are working up really beautifully together. If I hold up the project, you should be able to see this kind of myriad of crazy colours up here. Just do that so you can see. Now, I am having a little snafu with this, and in fact the lighting here makes it incredibly obvious to see. Infinitely more so than I would say it perhaps is in real life. So I am not alternating skeins, and this may well come back to bite me. So I have previously knit a version of the No Frills pullover in a beautiful mauve colourway. It is Woolenvine number 9 from Kristen of Woolenvine. Her yarns on the Volca base and her Ghost lace base, which is an MCN fingering weight and a Kid Silk mohair lace weight held together. I didn't alternate there. I didn't feel that I needed to. It was fine, it worked out fine. I got a little bit foolhardy and decided I don't need to alternate. These skeins all look the same. oh, not so much. So now, having finished working with one skein of the Das Mannschaft colourway in I Want to Believe, I'm now onto the second, and you can see the second is rather more kind of greeny and orangey, whereas the first is rather more bluey and purpley. And so together, there is a very, very kind of definitive point at which you can see the second skein rather, starting to come in now. I do think the lighting here that I've got set up is making it look a little bit more definitive than it is perhaps in reality, but that said, there is still a very definite line. And at the moment, I'm taking pause for thought. I finished off my Slabel hat and just kind of contemplated gently as to whether I want to go all the way back, rip it out and start working up with the second skein and seeing how I can perhaps getting a little bit more cohesive a colour with that skein and alternating those in. But we shall see. This lighting is making it far more defined than it is when I look at it in natural daylight. It is dark here, it's you know, Monday late afternoon, early evening. We have no more daylight, and therefore I am working with some fairly intensive non-natural lighting that we have in here. And certainly in daylight this looks far less definitive, but it's still there. And obviously there's no guaranteeing that I'm not going to be in unnatural light at certain times. So yeah, I'm taking a little bit of time. I'm giving it some time out. I'm just having a think as to whether I can be faffed, frankly, to go back and to rip it out and start over, given it is mohair and given the faff that we have in ripping out mohair. But yeah, we shall see. So other than that, oops, all going well. I have separated for the sleeves, as I've mentioned. I am following the same modifications with this version as I made in my previous version. They are all up on my previous project page, so please do take a look if you're interested. But essentially it is, I'm stopping the raglan increases a little bit earlier, so rather than having the full depth and the full batwinginess, if you like, and that is the technical term, of the sleeves in the original pattern, I'm making it more of a standard raglan. So I'm taking some of the depth out of the raglan increases by doing fewer of them and stopping them a little bit earlier, and then casting on the other stitches that I would be missing in when I cast on under the arm to then add the extra stitches needed for the body. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but if you are curious, please do feel free to go and check out my project page where I explain that in a little bit more detail. But yeah, alternating snafu aside, I'm still really happy with where this is going. I am going to give it another couple of days, just have a little bit of think about it, and then come back to it and work out whether I want to rip out and start alternating in that third skein in the hope that it's going to be a little bit more consistent with the previous version, or whether I want to just say bollocks to it and crack on as desired. But yeah, there's certainly a bit of a difference between the two, which is kind of annoying. And Ellie, I know you're going to say I told you so. The other whip that I have to show you this week is a brand new cast on, and as the saying goes, when you cast off one hat, it only makes sense to cast on another. It just so happened that as I cast off, or was close to casting off, my Slabel hat, a brand new pattern appeared, and it only made sense that I had to take my opportunity and knit it up. And so before I show you that, I just want to show you the bag in which it is living. This is a wonderful, wonderful cat bag. Now, if you recognise the print that's on this bag, cast your mind back to the sinister catdigan that we showed back in, I want to say maybe episode 2 of the podcast by Anne Cattenbig. And this is her glorious cat pattern, glorious, in a bag. So it has cat hair on it because, as I say, everything in my house has cat hair. If it's not cat hair, it's my hair, but either way, one or other of us has claimed it. So this is a screen printed bag that she was selling over at Yarnporium, which I attended not this weekend just gone, but the one before, back in early November in London. And for all that I didn't really buy anything much, I certainly didn't buy any yarn, as I promised last time. That was true. I did, however, pick up this very, very cute screen printed bag because it's got sinister cats on it. How could I not? But yes, she has a whole series of things made with this Sinister Cat character of hers, not least of which is her Sinister Catdigan cardigan. So I recommend you checking her stuff out because it is incredibly cute. But yeah, living in here is a test knit that I'm working on for the wonderful Kristen of Vullenvine. Kristen has just announced over on Instagram that she is working on a brand new hat pattern. The hat is sparkling cider. I will put her picture of it up here on the screen so you can appreciate it. It is just absolutely perfect. It's a glorious mix, of that is the new drinking game, isn't it? Ugh. It's a wonderful mix of both sock weight yarn or fingering weight yarn and a mohair held together to create a wonderful floofy texture. She has beads incorporated into her design, but the beads are optional, which is good because I am too cat-handed to be able to manage anything quite that fiddly. But without further ado, here is the version that I'm working up here. So this is my version of it. It is being knit in a couple of yarns that I will tell you about in a second, but in the first instance, let's just appreciate how lovely this is. So as per her design, it's got these gorgeous little cabled sections that look like little mini trees. So there are a few little crosses that kind of gradiate. They're all cables that kind of gradiate up to a point at the top. That's obviously where she's got her beads, but you can just make it a really simple cable twist instead, as well as obviously the super lovely and fluffy texture that you get from holding the mohair in there too. The pattern has you do a long tail cast on. Having just finished the slable hat with the alternating cable cast on, I decided I was going to be fancy and do that instead. It was an absolute bugger to do with the mohair. And so my stubbornness meant that I persevered, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone else that doesn't fancy an afternoon spent swearing and resorting to a strong cup of tea at one point. So yes, alternating cable cast on, very much optional, but it does look lovely, I will say that. Let me see if I can get a proper decent shot of it on here. So that's the kind of rounded edge that it gives you. It works up really nicely. I have no idea if this is focusing at all. Let's see if I can get it there. So yeah, the sort of rounded edge that it gives you is really lovely. But yes, so the yarns that I am using, just to fill you in on those, I have here some sock yarn that I picked up when I was over in a yarn story earlier on in the year. This is House of Alamode in their Redmond colourway. I believe this colourway is exclusive to a yarn story, which is a local yarn store that's based over in Bath. It is a fabulous mix of greys, of tealy blues, of foresty greens, little tiny speckles of kind of ochre-y colours and a little bit of brown in there too, actual brown, as well as just some flecks of sort of darker grey in there too. I have a sneaking suspicion that this is a colourway that's exclusive to a yarn story over in Bath. I think it may actually have been dyed for Carmen's father. I'm not totally sure 100% on that, but certainly it's a colourway in honour of them and their store. And I'm holding it together with Ching Fibres over here, which is in their Dark Forest colourway. This is a kid mohair silk blend, 70% ultrafine kid mohair and 30% silk. 100 grams of it is around 420 metres. And the House of Alamode is their 80-20, so it's 80% superwash merino, 20% nylon, 400 yards to 100 gram skein. And so yes, I had a couple of options in my stash. It does just require one skein of sock weight yarn and one skein of the kid mohair. I was playing around with a few different options. Some were a little bit more tonal, others were a little bit more variegated, such as this version here. I have a couple of little mohair skeins just up here in my stash. That's my little side row of mohair in there, playing with some of the options here and some of my sock yarns, but this ended up proving a winner. I actually sent a few options over to Kristen because I was very, very excited to start working on this for her, and this was the one we both agreed was probably going to be a really, really interesting version to have a look at. So yes, I know that her intention is to try and get this out in the early part of next month, obviously depending on all of our test knitters getting back to her in time. I've been knitting the pattern, as you can see. I started working on this yesterday and finished up last night. I haven't touched it as far as I go yet today, and so you can see it can work up fairly quickly. Alternating cast on aside, cable cast on aside, which is not in the pattern. It was my attempt at being fancy. It was more frustrating than I expected to be with the mohair involved, so feel free to ignore me entirely on that front, but it is working up pretty quickly. The cables are really, really satisfying and quick to knit. They're very, to coin the phrase, potato chippy, in the sense that you can just kind of keep going with them and keep going, but it's really, really enjoyable. So I'm hoping to get this finished sooner rather than later, pass on any comments I've got back to Kristen, and yeah, hopefully you'll be able to see this pattern out in the not too distant future. The only qualm I have in all of this is not down to the pattern at all, it's just a slight niggle to do with the yarn itself. So the Ching fibre in Dark Forest is a beautiful, saturated, deep colourway. It does mean that it bleeds a little bit on my hands. I've seen this a couple of times with hand-dyed fibres, particularly the mohair silk blend, because obviously it's a very fine lace weight yarn. It requires an awful lot of dye in order to get it this deep and this saturated, and it does just mean that it may be a little bit prone to bleeding. Some of the colours, the deeper sort of indigo linked colours in particular, and so it does mean that I get a little bit of it on my fingers as I knit, certainly in the places where I carry the yarn. So I tend to tension the yarn in my right hand, and you do tend to see a little pathway across my fingers from where it's been. It's not something that bothers me too much. It is something I'm going to need to be aware of when it comes to blocking the hat. Obviously it will need blocking because the last thing I want is to wear this, and while I can make do with hat hair, the notion of having a sort of lovely dark stripe of green across my head is perhaps less than ideal, and so I'm just going to need to make sure that when it comes to blocking it, I am giving it an opportunity to catch some of that dye that bleeds out. So perhaps I will look to reset it again with some more citric acid to do it at a slightly higher temperature to try and help the dye to set, or at the very, very least give it a lot of extra rinses to make sure that as much of the colours come out as needs to. So just one to bear in mind, but otherwise super pleasurable knit, really enjoying it, and yeah, hopefully you'll be able to get hold of it soon. And so now we move along to Vicarious knitting, and what I will say is bloody hellfire, you have been doing an amazing job of just helping my Vicarious knitting to grow in size and stature this week. So I knew that by kicking off our KAL and opening the chatter thread and starting to see what some of you were planning to make, I knew that was going to be a dangerous means of enabling myself. I don't think I really appreciated quite how much. In the last, I think, week or so since the thread has been open, we have hundreds of posts that are in there just now. I would so recommend you dropping in. If you don't want to go through everything, and I can appreciate that sometimes chatter threads can be quite overwhelming, if you go up to the top of the screen on that specific thread, so if you open the thread and go up to the top of the screen, there are a number of different callouts that Ravelry has that make it much easier just to see some of the patterns that people have been talking about. In particular, there is a little number that says this number of patterns. If you click on that, it will take you through, Ravelry's so clever, it will take you through to a search function where you can look at all of the patterns that have been talked about in more detail, and then actually then click into some of them and see some of them in a little bit more detail again. And it's so wonderful, and I did just want to take this week's Vicarious knitting section as an opportunity to talk to you a little bit more around some of the patterns that are being talked about over in the thread. Of course, I am delighted to see a couple of very familiar patterns being mentioned, not least of which is both No Frills, which is obviously the sweater pattern that I'm knitting with the black sock yarn and mohair held together at the moment, as well as the Cardamom Coffee hat, which I've completed a couple of in the last few podcasts. Certainly there is no shortage of mohair that's being bought at the moment, and again, I'm entirely happy to take full responsibility for that, no problems whatsoever. Buy all the mohair, blame me for all of it, I am fine with this. But alongside those, there is also mention of another very familiar pattern. So I showed back in episode 1 or 2, I think, I showed my work in progress Zweig sweater, and I'll put a picture of the pattern image up here on the screen. Zweig is a pattern by Caitlin Hunter, who is Boyland Knitworks, and it is a very, very well-known pattern, as are most of hers, in all honesty. But it's a gorgeous 2-colour project where you have the lace section with a little bit of twisted stitches, not necessarily full-on cabling, in the yoke, and then the rest of it is a sort of textured overall body, although I've seen an awful lot of people knit it completely plain stockinette as well. Both of them look lovely. So we have quite a few Zweigs that are being talked about over in the chatter thread. There is also a hat that is new to me as a pattern that really did leap out, and so I wanted to just give it a quick shout out here, and that is the textured triangle hat by Susanna Sommer, and I'll put a picture of it up on here. That was mentioned by Anchored over in the Ravelry thread, and as I say, it's a really simple, it's quite a plain hat, it's not particularly slouchy, there's a little bit of slouch to it, but it's not kind of big and oversized. It's just a really, really pretty textured hat. It is knit, for those of you who have seen my episode where I talk about the yarn that I wished would be mine but will not be mine, or cannot be mine for the colour, and the fact the colour really doesn't do me or it justice. The sample is knit in watery green, which is the Malabriga Rios colourway that I knit my worsted boxy in, that I talked about back on episode 4, and I don't think it was the pure mint colourway that drew me to this, but I do really love it. It can't work for me, and I wish it could, but it can't. But I do think it would work beautifully in other colours as well. But it's just a really, really pretty textured hat pattern with enough interest to kind of keep you going as you were knitting it, but not necessarily to be too overwhelming, perhaps to people who are just starting out with knitting, but also it could be quite a quick gift knit as well. Now, I appreciate that gift knitting isn't necessarily the aim of this KAL, but again, just one to bear in mind more than anything else. At the moment, I am definitely more into the garment side of knitting than I am accessories, but that being said, there was one shawl pattern that caught my eye, and this was a shawl that was mentioned by K2R2D2, fabulous name, but this is the Scottish Highlands shawl by Kay Hopkins. It's a really, really beautiful, quite simple stockinette and lace border, but it's really, really effectively done. It's knit here in 2 colours, although I'm sure you could knit it in one single colour if you so chose, but it's just a really simple, beautiful, very, very effective final finished project. And so again, it caught my eye as I was looking through it. I really don't have a particular drive to knit lace at the moment, to knit shawls at the moment. If I did, they would probably be on the sort of thicker side in a DK weight yarn perhaps, but this was certainly something that caught my eye, and I did think around, again, perhaps those of you that are going into slightly warmer times of year. I know from the welcome thread that there's quite a few folk that are based in Australia and in New Zealand, so perhaps this could be a lovely knit for you. But also those of you who, again, perhaps at some point want to contemplate a little bit of gift knitting, or just want to prepare for warmer weather coming next year. So again, a really, really lovely pattern that I just wanted to call out. There was also a sweater pattern mentioned that has been in my queue for quite some time, and again, if I have the opportunity to do it for this KAL, I will certainly look at that, and that is the Laurie sweater by Jose Paquin. This was mentioned by Shelley Bookworm, and it's just really pretty. Again, it is a very simple, straightforward textured knit. It has this gorgeous ribbing around the neckline here, and then the all over texture within the main body of the sweater itself. It's something that I have, as I say, had in my queue for quite a while. There are a number of different sweater quantities that I've looked at that would work brilliantly for this, and so it's definitely one that I would look at knitting. It just looks like such a lovely, comfy and slightly oversized, but without sort of being huge and sort of swampy. Swampy, that's not an attractive thing to say about a sweater. Oversized, too loose. It's certainly sort of a little bit of positive ease, but not too kind of huge at the same time. So no, that could be a really, really lovely knit as well. So between the Zweigs, the no frills, the Lori sweaters and everything else that people are knitting, whether they be garments, whether they be hats or accessories, whether they be gifts, and better you are than me, then please do feel free to check out the chatter thread, see what some people are planning on making, and then from Thursday onwards keep an eye on that FO thread and you'll be able to see the projects as they are completed. Also, a very, very quick mention to AJ, who is Glacier Flame, who took my challenge far too literally and has indeed gone into the chatter thread and written the word cheese 47 times. That did make me laugh quite a lot. Thank you for that, AJ. And well done you for still managing to keep it relevant as well. Bonus points. And so yes, the KAL will be kicking off from this Thursday. Please do feel free to keep an eye on the Ravelry group for some updates there, just a chance to see what people are up to, as well as the Knitting Vicariously hashtags and specifically the Blame Dunderknit Along hashtag over on Instagram. And that's it for this week. It may have been a slightly shorter episode than usual, I can't always tell. But yes, essentially, all gearing up, all systems go ahead of the KAL later on this week. A little bit less yarn purchasing now that I've settled back in. You've seen all my Rhinebeck indiscretions, you've seen all my USA indiscretions, just generally. They're now beautifully housed in my lovely stash wall behind me. And I think maybe we've reached, to coin the phrase that Amy used in her latest podcast, kind of wool saturation point. I think maybe we're just going to tone things down a little bit. I know that I've been stashing like the wind for a very long time now, but I think now maybe is the time to enjoy a little bit more of what I have and just kind of really make good use of some of the yarns that I've brought back in the last few months. At least until Christmas and EYF come round. But yes, as ever, you can find us over in the Knitting Vicariously Ravel group that I've mentioned throughout this entire podcast this week. It really is such a fantastic place to go to chat with other people, like-minded, wonderful individuals. Come and introduce yourself over in the welcome thread. Tell us about the vicarious tipple of your choice, and then come and say hello over in the KAL threads as well as our November chatter thread. Similarly, as I've mentioned, you can find all of the podcast notes for this week's episode over on Instagram at the Knitting Vicariously account, but you can also follow us using the various hashtags, whether it is Knitting Vicariously or whether it is Blame Dunderknit or Blame Dunderknit Along. If you'd like to find me, I am as ever Dunderknit over on Instagram and on Ravelry. And then yeah, ahead of our KAL later on this week, I hope you have a wonderful rest of day, rest of week. I hope your knitting is keeping you happy and fulfilled, and if it's not, I hope you have an opportunity to knit vicariously. Keep on, keeping on. I will see you again next time. Bye. I have a very unwilling co-host this week. He's staring at me because he wants food. Hey bud. What you doing? What you doing? Do you want to be on the podcast? My cat's actually a little bit jealous of how much I've been petting this. You just staring at me because you want food, even though you've already had your breakfast and something that constitutes lunch, even though cats don't get lunch. Yeah? So please do come and join us on the Blame Dunderclap. No. Hobbes has now moved to sit behind the camera so that he is genuinely just sitting and staring up at me. Buddy, it's not your tea time. It's not. I know you think it is because it's dark, but it's not. So let me turn around and try and show you some of the decreases. Let me just, if I do that, I mean, let's be honest, right now I have no idea what you're looking at. You might be looking at my hat, you might be looking at the stash wall, you might not be able to see anything. And just, who knows? Who knows? This is quite a nice view actually. I might just do it all like this.